The humiliation hit before my name did. Under the hard white lights of the school office, the receptionist's smile sharpened into a sneer as she slid my folder back with two lacquered nails, theme inappropriate, while my grandson stood beside me, backpack sagging, a violet bruise pooling at his lip. The copier coughed, the floor smelled of lemon and dust, and every eye in line learned our place as her badge flashed like a tiny siren and she topped the counter with a pen as if striking a match. I felt the room measure us, her perfume cold and expensive, his breath shallow and brave, and I promised the clock, the walls, and the policy on the bulletin board that this wasn't ending at a smirk and a stamp. Because before the day is done, the folder she tried to bury will open like a stage light and turn their rules into our road. Before we continue, please subscribe and check in below. Where are you tuning in? If this hits home, share it so fewer elders carry this weight. The humiliation arrived before my name did. I set my folder on the counter, asked for a project intake number, and the receptionist slid my papers back the width of a fingernail as if they carried static. Theme inappropriate, she said, voice low but aimed to carry. I felt the eyes in the line tightened on my shoulders. The wall clock beat a slow pulse above us. The copier coughed behind glass. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and warm toner. I lifted the cover of my folder and let the contents breathe on the slick laminate. A civic learning opinion written in plain language, a two-part mural plan, a study calendar with dates and volunteers, permission slips, an attendance sheet from our community meeting, notes from visits to the Indigenous Cultural Center in the Maritime Museum. Every page had its place. The folder had a crease where my thumb knew to stop. I set the opinion paper on top, so the heading sat like a small lighthouse. I said I was here to open a protocol, citing the district's student participation policy. My voice stayed steady, lined with the patience I keep in the same drawer as my grief. The receptionist wore a plastic badge that flashed under fluorescent bars. She said I needed a teacher's rubric. I pointed to the signed authorization from the history teacher. She said the stamp looked faint. I showed the date, the signature, the reply email confirming it. She said an attachment was missing. I fanned the tabbed section labeled Fieldwork and slid out the sign-in from the museum, still smelling faintly of dust and salt from the old halls on display. The man behind me shifted, keys whispering in his pocket. Somewhere down the hall, a shoe squeaked and a locker door clanged. The receptionist flattened her lips and wrote nothing. My grandson stood by the doorway with his backpack resting on his toes. He is a quiet boy who keeps his gaze level like a carpenter's bubble. He held his spiral notebook against his ribs the way I used to hold my lunch pail, and the purple mark at the corner of his mouth had already turned the color of metal. He didn't speak. I didn't either. Not about the word that found him between periods, not about the small circle of laughter that followed him down the hall like a gum wrapper stuck to a shoe. He was my ally today, not my wound. He had the photos on his phone from the cultural center, the reading list, the chart we made together to show how learning would come before paint. I felt him there, the way you feel a hand at the ready, not to push, but to brace. I asked the receptionist for the rule in writing. She reached for a laminated sheet that listed fees, then stopped. I told her the policy has a section for civic relevance projects, fee waived, procedure based. I said I could wait while she looked it up. She didn't like that. She said I needed a superior to approve anything sensitive. She tapped the folder with a pen, a little drumbeat of disapproval. Sensitive can be another word for no. Sensitive is how people set scissors to a ribbon and call it safety. I kept the folder open, pages like small windows, and inhaled the paper's chalk scent above the lemon wipe. The clock tugged at my attention. 10:08. A bell would ring soon and spill noise into this clean box of a room. And noise is good for certain truths. I aligned the study calendar under the opinion paper, the way my wife taught me to stack bowls in a sink so water would find its path. The receptionist announced that the student activity coordinator would be too busy to sign, that another approval might be needed, that today might not be a good day. I let her words pass over like steam. I asked again for the policy language. Section 4.2, I said, where projects tied to civic understanding are to be treated as opportunities for structured learning with mediation and documented sources. She looked at me then with the same expression I've seen in waiting rooms and front desks since long before my hair went white. A look that counts seconds and hopes you will count yourself out. The copier clicked and warmed and released the sheet. The lemon cleaner lifted where someone had wiped too quickly. I remembered the way my wife folded school letters on our kitchen table, how she would press the crease with the side of her hand and say, "Even a paper wants a path." I stood with the folder like a small table I'd carried in, a surface of order in a room that preferred drift. The receptionist said my paperwork still lacked an internal form that the school uses for risk classification. I turned the folders tab to policy support and slid out a printed page with highlighted lines. The district's addendum allows conditional classification when a mitigation plan exists. Ours did, in plain ink. Mediated discussions, guided sources, supervision by the history teacher, involvement of community partners, pre-painting workshops on representation and context. I placed the page so her eyes could fall on the paragraph without tripping. She read far enough to sigh and reach for her phone. I kept my voice near the ground. I requested a protocol number and a date-stamped receipt. I asked for the supervisor of the district office to review attachments and timelines. The man with the jingling keys had stopped shifting. Others in line had learned the choreography of my patience. My grandson tilted his notebook and scribbled a square with a line through it, the sign we use to remind ourselves that balance is built. She called inside and used a tone that tried to make me a problem. While she spoke, I organized the stack again. Opinion, calendar, permissions, attendance sheet, field work log, partner letters, policy addendum. The folder cover was soft from years of use, the color of weathered teal. It had not failed me in my working days or my union days or when we fought to get a crosswalk near the bus stop. The smell of paper takes a person backward and forward at once. I held that scent and stared at the clock because staying in time is part of staying in fight. The inner door was a slab of beige with a push bar polished by hundreds of palms. It opened a fraction, and the receptionist leaned to explain my request. I heard the practice phrases: sensitive content, potential controversy, administrative discretion. The door closed with a whisper. The receptionist looked back at me, and in that small pause measured the distance between an old man with the folder and the policy pinned to a bulletin board. She told me to wait to the side so others could proceed. I did, but I didn't retreat. I slid the folder 6 inches along the counter so anyone waiting could see the pages, as clear as a plate under glass. My grandson stepped closer. He didn't touch the folder. He didn't need to. He anchored me without leaning, the way a lamppost throws a shadow you can stand on. I noticed a faint smell of cafeteria pizza moving down the hall as the bell chattered and a tide of voices broke against the office windows. A cart rattled past with boxes of copy paper, the white edges bright as teeth. Every object had something to say about order and the work it takes to maintain it. A woman I recognized from last year's fundraiser slid into the line. She glanced at my folder, scanned the opinion paper, and then looked at my grandson's cheek where the color of metal had darkened. She didn't say a word. She smoothed the strap of her purse and faced forward. Sometimes silence is a shield. Sometimes it is a wall. I didn't spend the moment deciding which.
The receptionist returned to the phone, to the keyboard, to the crease between her eyebrows. She told me the supervisor was in review and would step out if necessary. I asked that the necessity be recorded on the receipt when he came. I don't raise my voice around paper. I let paper raise his own. I asked for the time of my request to be noted. She wrote it with a small reluctance you could hear in the pen, and then capped the pen like a verdict. I arranged my documents one last time and rested both hands on either side of the folder. The counter was cold where the laminate had chipped. The light hummed in the ballast above us. In the hallway, a whistle blew, and then another door opened somewhere distant, the building exhaling. I thought of my wife again, of the way she would nod from a doorway when I had arranged something just so, then walk away to let it hold. My grandson's breath came steady, near my elbow. The beige door swung wider. A man in a navy blazer with a laminated district badge stepped through with a slow, deliberate gait, his face set to neutral, the way people set glasses on a shelf. He scanned the counter, saw the folder open like a small map, and reached for it. He didn't introduce himself. He took the folder the way a person takes a tray they expect to be heavy, and it was, but not because of paper. He turned and moved to a side table near the window, almost the same height as the counter, and I followed, my grandson a soft shadow to my left. The glass pane trapped a rectangle of gray daylight that smelled faintly of wet wool from coats drying on wall hooks. The supervisor opened to the first page and began a slow migration through the stack, fingertip pressing each corner flat, eyes scanning the way a surveyor reads land. He started with the attendance sheet from our community meeting. He checked dates, then traced signatures, pausing at the ones written in careful block letters by parents who avoid cursive because they were never taught to trust their own names. He set that sheet down and lifted the permission slips. He examined ballpoint strokes at the bottom of each, hunting for hesitation, as if a pause in ink could be a hole in intent. I let him look. Paper deserves to be read. The light above us hummed without commitment. When he reached the study calendar, he ran a nail along the vertical lines that separated weeks into phases: read, discuss, workshop, draft, review, paint. I'd drawn those lines with a ruler in my kitchen table while stew cooled and the smell of thyme filled the room. He pushed the calendar aside and placed the civic learning opinion squarely in the center. That page mattered. It framed the mural not as decoration, but as a record of learning. I saw his jaw set as he read the phrases about relevance, mediation, and source integrity. I watched the attendance there. 2 chords, tighten and release, tighten and release. His job was to make sure our chords stayed within the district's loom. My grandson moved half a step closer, phone ready, the black case worn at the edges from being put away before a bell. He opened a folder of images and held the screen face down until it would be asked to speak. He was steady. His presence kept my breath from breaking into smaller breaths. I imagined a gentle line from his shoulder to mine, a string that vibrated without sound, reminding me that patience is easier when you're not alone in it. The supervisor found something to like: the division of the mural into halves with commitments to context. He marked a small check beside that paragraph with the tip of a capped pen, then resumed the hunt for what would make him say no. This is the choreography of oversight: 1 step toward, 2 steps back, and a pause near the edge. He asked the receptionist for a stack of sticky notes and tore one without looking, the sound a small rip of cloth. He stuck it to the calendar and wrote a number I could not see. He turned to the policy addendum I had printed and underlined. He murmured the section heading under his breath, the way people taste the spice before deciding if it belongs in a pot. I kept still. The lemon cleaner in the room had faded to a warm, slightly sour hint. The copier behind glass exhaled and fell silent.
Then came the pause I had expected. He noticed the school's internal form for risk classification wasn't among my papers. He didn't look at me when he noticed it. He looked at the receptionist. She lifted her chin as if to say, "There it is." I slid a single page from the folder labeled Policy Support and placed it where his eyes could land without jumping. The policy allows conditional classification when there is a mitigation plan. There was. It was written in clean lines and bullet marks because sometimes clarity has to pretend to be simple to survive the first glance. He read. He tapped a paragraph. He tapped again. He didn't smile, but his mouth loosened from its strict line. He noted the presence of the mitigation plan and the named partners from the cultural center and the museum. He asked for the student activity coordinator, and I felt a hitch in the room. That person thrives in the gray areas where words like sensitive and controversial do their slow work. The receptionist sped away and returned with the coordinator, who wore a lanyard decorated with tiny whistles, each one a reminder of control. The coordinator scanned the top page, then the next, then leaned on the table with the posture of someone nursing a secret allergy to responsibility. I watched eyes slide past the policy lines and fix on the idea of schedule conflicts and community optics. I let that slide past me and placed the civic learning opinion closer to the edge, where sunlight found it. Minutes layered like thin dust. People came and went, the office filling with a low burr that pressed against the glass. The line moved around us like water around a stone. I kept my voice thoughtful, not loud. I asked for the protocol number to be open now so the clock would begin, as the policy requires. I asked that the receipt include the time and the acknowledgement of fee waiver, because civic relevance isn't a coupon, it's a commitment. The supervisor wrote the time. He had the look of a person angling for precision, because precision, once on paper, protects everyone who is willing to be protected. My grandson lifted his phone when the supervisor asked about documentation of field work. He did not speak. He scrolled to the images and held them out like a lantern. Photos of us at the cultural center, standing beside a display of river names that predate asphalt. Images from the Maritime Museum where wood and rope and salt have their own alphabet. A picture of his notebook page where he had penned a question about maps that exclude voices. The supervisor studied those images longer than he had studied signatures. For a moment the room softened at the edges. The coordinator coughed into a fist and looked at the clock. The supervisor circled back to the policy. He turned to the final page of the addendum, a half sheet I had attached with a paper clip, the color of old pennies. He read an itemized list of special conditions for dates that stir public debate. The words were balanced like a scale. Support meaningful exploration, ensure mediation, document sources, avoid tokenism, allow history to be more than applause or punishment. He nodded once and then paused. There, in the smallest type at the bottom, was a sentence about a preliminary review of the project's pauta, a pre-analysis to ensure that the process would not become spectacle. It was the kind of sentence that hides in footers and wakes only when called. He asked the receptionist to open the district's internal system. The screen lit his face with a stale blue. He searched our school. He searched our date. His fingers moved the way all fingers move when they are trying to make software behave. Lines of text appeared, neat as fence posts. I recognized the school's initials, the category for student activities, the tag that turns a project into a docket. The supervisor found an entry. The pre-analysis had been requested. The status field beside it was blank.
The coordinator leaned in as if the screen could apologize. The receptionist glanced at me the way a person glances at weather they had not expected. The supervisor tapped the blank field and a small menu opened. The options might as well have been carved in stone.
pending, approved, denied. He didn't select anything. He looked at me, then at my grandson, then back at the policy printout. The silence in that moment weighed more than paper. This is how pressure is applied without leaving marks. I returned my hands to either side of the folder and felt the edge of his cardboard bite my palms. I thought of my wife's steadying nods, of the way she would place a spoon on a napkin to avoid a stain, and then insist the napkin be washed anyway. Care and procedure are cousins. The office smelled now of warm electronics and cafeteria trays passing in waves somewhere down the hall. The tiny muscles along the supervisor's jaw flexed twice more. He reopened the civic learning opinion and placed it beside the screen, as if to make the policy stand shoulder to shoulder with the field it governs. Humiliations had layered themselves quietly since I stepped to the counter. The pen tapping that meant suspicion, the sticky note that hit a number, the way the coordinator's shoulders folded around the word optics, as if learning were a mirror to arrange at flattering angles. Each was small, but together they made a ridge I could feel underfoot. I kept my balance by keeping my gaze on the writing, the highlighted line, the underlined section, the dates where evidence had been gathered honestly and cleanly. My grandson shifted at my side and set his phone screen face down again. He is a boy who knows when to brighten a room and when to keep it from glare. He didn't squeeze my arm. He didn't need to. I felt taller for having him nearby, the way a flag feels taller when there are hands beneath it, even if the wind is low. The supervisor inhaled audibly. He tapped the keyboard and clicked into the pre-analysis request. The entry opened into a deeper view that showed who had asked for it and when. A timestamp glowed like a small ember. No confirmation, no reviewer assigned, no movement where there should have been at least a whisper of it. The supervisor looked over the monitor at the coordinator, and the coordinator looked at the flow. The receptionist clicked her pen open and closed, a cricket that had wandered into winter. I asked that the protocol for our main project be open regardless, tethered to the pre-analysis by the number the system would assign. I wanted the clock to start in a place it could be heard. The supervisor considered, then shook his head without malice. The pre-analysis, by that small sentence in small type, had to exist in a completed state before the main file could breathe. The policy giveth, and the policy holds. He reached for a form from a drawer and set it on the table, the paper empty except for the printed word request at the top. He placed his hand flat on the blank field where a status should have been, and I understood the distance between my folder and a door I could not yet open. A single word in a box on the screen that no one had chosen to fill. The status line blinked once and stayed empty. The empty status field stared back at us like a window that refused to show a room. I asked for the pre-analysis to be opened on the spot and tied to my folder by number, and the supervisor's fingers began their patient march. He typed in the request, and the system coughed up a new identifier, a thin vein of progress under glass. I asked for the timestamp to be written on my receipt, and when the pen met paper, I felt the smallest click inside my chest, a gear that had been waiting months to turn. My grandson leaned in just enough to read the digits and wrote them on his notebook, copying them so neatly that the numbers looked calmer than I felt.
We stood while the printer spit a warm page that smelled like dry toast and ink. The receptionist slid it across the table with a taste of lime cleaner in the air, a smell that always tries to pretend is fresh. I asked, in the same low voice I used on job sites when a measurement mattered, that our main project be tethered to this new pre-analysis in the system notes.
The supervisor did it with a slow thoroughness that made the hum of the bulbs sound almost like approval. He opened a field and typed our title, then pulled the district policy beside the monitor as if to let the 2 pages agree with each other. Every small motion was a bead on a string I refused to drop. He told us that once the pre-analysis moved to review, the item would go to the public session agenda. That meant a podium, a timer, a hall of faces, and a room that might mistake patience for weakness. I asked for the link to the agenda page and the deadline for submitting support documents. He wrote both on my receipt. My grandson snapped a photo of that slip and stored it in a folder named Pathway, his thumb steady as a level bubble. We turned our folder into a small engine, then stepped back into the corridor where the bell peeled the air and a rush of students dragged heat in on their jackets. The hallway smelled like pencil shavings and cafeteria steam. We walked without speaking until the building's exhale no longer felt like it pushed us backward. Outside, the air sat cool on my gums, the way it does when a cold front decides to keep its promise. We went home the way we always do when the day tries to lean on our shoulders, across the small park, past the dogwood that lost its blossoms early, over the cracked crosswalk where we won a fight a decade ago. My folder rolled against my ribs, warm. At the kitchen table, we turned the day into steps. I laid out the opinion paper, the plan, the calendar, and the policy. My grandson charged his phone and pulled out his laptop, the fan whispering. I hand-wrote a simple outline for the presentation that listed the elements in the order they build a bridge: purpose, process, sources, mediation, partners, phases. He made a slide folder and labeled each page with quiet precision. The house filled with the tiny sounds of readiness: pencils tapping, keys ticking, drawers thudding softly, the kettle hiccuping just before it gives up a boil. I set 2 mugs on cork coasters and watched steam carry the smell of tea through the old window frames. Humiliation doesn't always shout. Often it lingers like a draft around your ankles. I could feel it there as I arranged documents, the memory of the pen tapping, the sticky note that hit a number, the way the word optics sat like a smirk in the coordinator's throat. I let it pass through me the way wind moves around a body that refuses to lean. My wife used to say that some days are made of pebbles in your shoes. You take the pebbles out, but your feet still remember the stones. I took off my shoes and stretched my toes, then went back to the table. We gathered our proof of field work and made it easy to hold. Photos printed on matte paper so they wouldn't glare. Captions typed in a font big enough to read without squinting. A short bibliography with the clean dignity of plain English. My grandson arranged the images in 2 neat rows. The first showing what we learned from the Indigenous Center: river names, bead patterns that tell a story, maps that refuse straight lines. And the second showing the museum's bones, timbers, knots, instruments of sky and sea. He placed the row of rivers above the row of routes, stacked in a way that asked the eyes to read both at once. He did it without saying why. He didn't need to. I printed the policy sections we had already underlined and added sticky tabs that stood like little flags. 4.2 for civic projects, the fee waiver clause, the mitigation standard, and the new pre-analysis requirement that it tried to hide. I labeled each tab with a single word because paper prefers simple signals when the room gets loud. At the edge of the table, I built a small toolkit: hole punch, extra clips, spare pens, an enveloped copy of the attendance sheet from our community meeting, 3 consent forms still smelling of toner. The folder grew heavier and I grew lighter.
For 2 nights, we prepared without bragging about it. After dinner, we cleared dishes and returned to the table. I rubbed the polish into the folder's corners where the cardboard had grown soft. My grandson adjusted slide pacing, setting a comfortable beat that would let the audience breathe without wondering. I practiced turning pages with the economy of motion that respect demands. Every few minutes, I stepped away and found the quiet that hides behind a refrigerator's hum. Then I stepped back in, each time seeing some small thing I could smooth or stack. The agenda posted on the third morning, and over oatmeal that tasted a little like cardboard and a little like victory, we found our item, listed near the end, below announcements and a facilities request for new light bulbs. A placement like that is a tactic. Time is another zipper people close on you. I wrote the number on a sticky note and put it in my wallet. My grandson copied it in his notebook and then on the inside of his wrist, where only he would see it. We added to our toolkit a portable charger, 2 extra paper clips, a bottle of water, a pack of tissues to dull a sudden cough. My hands moved slower than they used to, but they did not shake. The day of the meeting, the air was the color of dishwater, and everything smelled damp, even stone. We arrived early enough to watch the custodian wheel out a lectern that squeaked. The auditorium held a polished wood scent under a layer of dust warmed by the first bodies to enter. The PA system tested itself with 2 pops and a hiss. Metal chairs clicked into rows. One of the representatives from the Indigenous Center took a seat on the aisle, a notebook already open. The museum educator arrived with a tote bag that jingled with pens. My grandson and I took the second row, where you can see faces without having to tilt your head like a question. I kept a folder on my lap and felt the faint vibration of my own heartbeat in my thigh. As people filtered in, I watched the small exchanges that make a room choose its mood. A nod between the supervisor and the chair, a corridor glance shared by the receptionist and the coordinator, a flick of fingers at a watch. Oppression does not always arrive as a word. Sometimes it is a schedule that chips away at what you allowed to say. I reminded myself that the clock is a tool, too. If they used it, so would I. My grandson placed his phone face down on the seat between us and lined up the edges of our printed photos like tiles on a floor that must be level if the table above is to stand. The meeting opened with routine matters that moved as if the room had an invisible conveyor belt. Budgets and maintenance, a note about parking lot lights, a cheer for a team's achievement. The pages rustled, the gavel made its dull wooden knock, and the PA breathed in and out. I let the sound sink in. It wasn't a song I liked, but it was the music we had to dance to if we wanted our minutes on the floor. Our agenda items sat there like a child at the end of a lunch line. As speakers took their place, a new sheet appeared on the chair's clipboard, and the whisper traveled down the table. Time constraints, condensed schedule, items may be deferred. My grandson wrote the word time on his notebook and drew a small box around it. Then another, a quiet stacking that kept me from grinding my teeth. The chair rearranged the order of items as chairs do. I felt the familiar slant as the list tipped away from us. When the line of speakers thinned and the clock moved uphill toward the hour, a sheet of paper was placed discreetly in front of the chair. The whisper hardened into a plan. Our item slid to the last slot with the modesty of someone being told to wait their turn at a bus stop that is about to end service. I kept my hands on the folder. The supervisor watched the chair with a gaze that pretended to be blank. The coordinator inspected a hangnail as if it were an assignment. At last, the chair announced the final item and glanced at the clock with a public regret that felt rehearsed. The gavel lifted, and the microphone caught a small intake of breath from somewhere in the first row. The chair raised a hand to declare the session adjourned for time, and I stood with my folder open, the policy section number bright under the lights. If you're still with me, tap like, drop your opinion in the comments, and share. your voice pulls more chairs to this table. I kept my body in the space between the gavel and the adjournment and reached for the only lever that doesn't crack under pressure, the rule itself. The meeting had a section that allowed a brief technical exposition tied to an item already on the agenda when clarification would materially inform the body. I had copied that clause onto a card the size of my palm and kept it tucked inside the folder's front pocket. I lifted the card not as a challenge, but as a reminder, and held the folder open so the policy citation faced the dais. The chair paused, eyes moving to the supervisor, then to the page, then to the clock whose red digits made no moral claims. The gavel hovered, and in the hum of the PA, consent moved through the room like a small current. The chair marked a note on the agenda, recorded the allowance in the minutes, and motioned for the lectern to be rolled closer. I carried the folder to the lectern and laid out the pages in the order the project would live. Purpose on the left, process in the center, sources and mediation to the right. My grandson lifted the small projector from his backpack and set it on the front row seat, cable already coiled with the neatness of someone who respects time and wires. The auditorium lights dimmed 2 degrees, enough to let images breathe without turning faces into shadows. The lectern smelled faintly of furniture polish and old announcements. My hands found their place on the wood the way a mason's hands find confidence in a level. I began with the simple spine of the plan, the spine that never moved even when counters and schedules tried to push it out of alignment. The project existed to turn a wound into inquiry and a controversy into structure. The mural would be an outcome, not a spectacle. Learning would come first and paint would come later, under supervision, under guidance, under the weight of sources that had been read aloud and considered. I did not name the insult that struck my grandson. The room did not need a reenactment. It needed a blueprint that could hold children and adults without splintering. I slid the civic learning opinion to the center and tapped the paragraph that treated sensitive dates as a doorway, not a trap. The policy allowed this approach, and more than that, invited it. I named the sections by number and plain description. The fee waiver clause had been triggered by the civic scope. The coordinator's earlier hesitation now had a place to sit down and rest. The requirement for mitigation and mediation had been addressed through partnerships and a documented plan. The sticky note that hid a number no longer had anywhere to stick. The pre-analysis clause, once a thin string at the bottom of a page, was now active and tied by a timestamp to our main file. The blank status that had stalled us had been made to move. Each small knot in the line loosened as paper found its words in public air. My grandson brought the first image to the screen. River names layered like soft braids over a map. The lines running not as rulers demand, but as ground and water insist. He had added captions that could be read from the back row without squinting. The photos were matte, the projector focused, the edges of the screen clean against the wall. The second image followed, rope and wood from the Maritime Museum, the grain of a timber worn smooth by hands that did not make history alone. He had arranged the sequence so that the eyes would move from one to the other and back again, asking the same question the project asked. What do we hold together when accounts conflict, and how do we keep the holding honest? I placed on the lectern the attendance sheet from the community meeting, the permission letters, the notes from partners at the Indigenous Center and the museum. The coordinator's rubrics and stamps no longer floated as obstacles. They docked as confirmations. The fee entry, once a mutter, had turned to a line on the receipt that said waived as policy intends. The coordinator sat 2 rows back, fingers still, shoulders no longer folded around the word optics.
The receptionist near the aisle watched the marked policy section travel from my folder to the lectern to the screen and back, and the reluctance in her pen stroke had nowhere to live. I turned the study calendar so it faced the dais and traced the phases with a fingertip. Week 1 would not chase headlines, it would read. Week 2 would not chase applause, it would discuss. Week 3 would not chase paint, it would workshop language and images. Week 4 would draft and revise. Only after this would brushes touch primer. The two halves of the mural would be curated debates, not declarations carved in stone. A facilitator's guide would keep conversations on rails. A bibliography would keep sources anchored. I felt the room lean forward, not in hunger for drama, but in relief that plan can be a quieter cousin of courage. Subplots slipped into their rightful places with the soft clicks of drawers closing. The rubrica that had pretended to be a missing limb gave way to the authorized signature already present. The carimbo that had been questioned folded into the waiver protocol that the policy foresaw. The risk classification discovered its conditional path, where mitigation is documented and partners stand named. The reordering of agenda, which had flirted with becoming a tactic, met the rule that granted time for technical exposition, and a note in the minutes bent the mishap into a recommendation for future order. The small humiliations, recorded internally like tiny bruises, did not need applause to fade. They needed light and procedure. My grandson advanced to a slide that mapped the service element, not as a token, but as a useful arm of learning. A book drive for the community center. A guided visit sequence that would include students who had not attended, and a reflection worksheet designed to teach the difference between agreement and understanding. He had designed the worksheet with clean boxes and patient sentences, the kind that build habits without scolding. The museum educator, 3 rows back, nodded in a way that felt like the sound of a good joint settling into place. I described our plan for documentation. Photographs at each phase taken by a rotating student team under a simple code of respect, an end-of-unit report with a table of sources, and a 1-page reflection from each participant on what nuance feels like when it resists tidy conclusions. I placed a stack of blank consent forms on the edge of the lectern as if to remind the room that even good projects ask permission. The supervisor wrote in his notebook with an economy that can only grow in someone who is tired of watching paper get used as a wall. The room's temperature seemed to rise a degree, though the air remained the same. That is what alignment does inside a body. My grandson kept the light steady and the slides moving with the tempo of a late train that still honors each stop. He stood the way he had stood in the office, near but not overshadowing, a living margin that held the text. I concluded the exposition the way a craftsperson sweeps dust into a palm and finds the lines beneath. The project fit the policy as water fits a bed it has earned over time. The pre-analysis sat lit, not hidden. The fee waiver had a place to belong. The mediation plan carried names and dates and tools that could be picked up by hands other than mine. The mural would not be a single voice painted loud. It would be 2 strands braided with enough tension to hold without tearing. I let the final image rest on the screen, a pencil sketch of the wall, taped gridded paper showing where each theme would rise, and a blank border left purposefully empty for notes and learning that would appear during the work itself. When I stepped back from the lectern, the folder remained open, not as a banner, but as a bench. The chair recorded that the item had been presented with supporting documentation. The minutes took in the sections of policy by number. The supervisor underlined the pre-analysis ID on his copy. The coordinator's clipboard settled on the table without its customary shuffle. The room breathed through the PA's low hiss and through the simple fact that a plan, once seen in full, changes the shape of a conversation. I gathered the papers in the order they would need to be found again, slid each tab where it could be grabbed without scraping, and closed the folder with the tenderness of putting a child to bed. My grandson coiled the cable and returned the projector to his backpack, then straightened the row of printed photos on the seat for the record keeper to collect. The lights returned to their earlier brightness with a quiet click that sounded in my chest, like a door frame being measured and found true. The chair announced that the body would move the item to deliberation according to procedure, and that the minutes would reflect the documentation received. I felt the weight shift from proving to waiting, from pushing to holding. It was not triumph. It was alignment. The auditorium smelled of varnish and paper and the faint sweetness of dust caught in sun. I stood with my grandson at the end of the second row, the folder pressed gently against my coat, and let the settled air prepare a place for what had to come next. Deliberation began with the sound of paper being squared. The chair eased the agenda into alignment, and the supervisor placed his notebook beside it, spine parallel to the lip of the table. The room shifted from presentation to judgment, that thin air where voices choose what kind of school tomorrow will be. I kept the folder against my chest and felt its corners press a map into my shirt. My grandson sat so close our sleeves touched. The PA hummed like breath held. The chair read the item title, then the pre-analysis number we had dragged into daylight. The digits landed in the minutes with the clack of a stamp. The supervisor summarized the policy sections in a tone that sounded like a ruler sliding along wood. He named the fee waiver clause. He named the mitigation and mediation standard. He named the allowance for technical exposition that had just steadied the evening. He did not name me. He did not need to. The work sat on the lectern, cool and factual. Members asked their questions. They came in careful steps: scope, supervision, sources, safeguards. Each question had a place to land because we had built places. I watched the coordinator study the tabletop as the mitigation plan was read aloud, line by line, until the word optics had nothing to cling to. I watched the receptionist hear the fee waiver clause described without apology. The air took on the faint sweetness of varnish warming under lights. Somewhere near the rear, a pen tapped once and stopped. The chair offered proposed conditions, the kind that turn approval from a door into a frame. Staff training at the front office on welcoming and routing sensitive projects according to policy. A brief workshop for faculty on facilitating difficult history with documented sources and a shared vocabulary. 2 community partners, named in the file, to attend the first and third study sessions as resource witnesses. A timeline with checkpoints: read, discuss, workshop, draft, review. Photographic documentation by a rotating student team under a code of respect. A final report with bibliography to be added to the district archive. Each condition went onto the screen, letters bright as chalk on a clean board. I felt heat in my chest, not anger, something closer to lift. My grandson drew a small square in the margin of his notebook and shaded it until it looked like a window at dusk. His breath steadied my own. The chair asked if there were amendments. None rose. The chair asked for comments. A hand lifted from the back row, a parent who had signed our attendance sheet in careful block letters. The parent spoke about wanting their child to stand in a school that can hold more than one truth at the same time. The words were plain and landed softly, like coats laid over a sleeping child.
The chair closed comment and named the vote. The word carried weight across the wood and carpet. Members marked their sheets. The supervisor watched their hands, not their faces, because hands tell the truth first. The room paused in the soft rattle of clipped paper. Then the chair read the count, approved with conditions, entered into the minutes under the sections the supervisor had recited. The decision did not make a sound, but my body heard it anyway, the way you hear a steadying beam settle in a house. Consequences began to unspool before anyone stood. The chair asked the supervisor to coordinate the front office training within 2 weeks and to document attendance. The receptionist, still at the aisle, wrote the date in a planner with a deliberate slowness that told me the pen would not be reluctant next time. The chair requested that the student activity coordinator meet with partners to schedule the 2 resource sessions and file the confirmations in the docket. The coordinator nodded, the lanyard of tiny whistles lined still against a chest that no longer tried to hide. The chair added a recommendation to future agendas. Items involving civic learning projects should not be set at the end by default to avoid silencing instruction by exhaustion. That line went into the minutes, a small hinge fixed in public view. The supervisor spoke once more, not to praise, but to record. He stated that the fee waiver had been applied correctly under the Civic Relevance Clause and that earlier confusion at the counter would be addressed through training. He added that the pre-analysis process would be revised to prevent a request from stalling in a blank field without an assigned reviewer. He proposed a weekly tickler report that would list pending pre-analyses so that a sentence in small type could not govern a whole month by neglect. The chair accepted the proposal and asked for a written plan by the next meeting. The minutes caught that too. I let the folder rest on my knees and thought of my wife's hands rubbing oil into a piece of dry wood until it remembered its own shine. The shame laid on us at the counter had not vanished. Shame rarely obeys orders. But it had been given a new place to live, in the acknowledgments and the remedies, not in my grandson's body. He sat straighter, the black case of his projector, cable coiled tight again, like a small good habit. I did not smile. My face felt too full. I let the air travel all the way to the bottom of my lungs and fill the corners. The chair turned to us and asked if the documentation used tonight could be deposited with the clerk for the district archive. I slid from the folder a set of copies made for this purpose and placed them on the edge of the dais. The paper felt cool and grainy under my fingertips. The clerk took the stack, stacked it again, and set it beside the open ledger. The ledger smelled of ink and time. The moment had the sound of a door closing softly in a house where everyone is finally home. The meeting moved on to other business, the way rivers keep moving even after they pass a bend where something mattered. My grandson and I stayed seated until the gavel's final knock. People stood and talked in channels. The museum educator touched 2 fingers to her tote in a small salute, then made a note on her phone. The representative from the Indigenous Center signed a form and folded it into a pocket that looked ready for such labor. The coordinator walked over and asked for our availability to schedule the first resource session. The voice carried no varnish, just dates. We spoke in specifics the way builders speak before they pour concrete. The receptionist approached with a copy of our receipt, now bearing 3 new lines: the train and date, the docket number for our item, and the pre-analysis ID marked as reviewed. She met my eyes in a way she had not at the counter. It was not warmth, not yet. It was recognition of a shared frame. She said the front office would be closed for 1 hour on a Tuesday morning to learn. That line mattered more than anyone would clap for. We packed quietly. My grandson slid the projector into his backpack and tucked the cable into its nest. I buttoned my coat and let the folder rest under my arm, lighter by the weight of copies given away and heavier by the weight of a vote. The auditorium smelled now of wool and scuffed rubber, in the faintest carry of lemon from a last-minute wipe on the lectern. The PA hissed and then fell silent. The aisle runner made a soft sound under our shoes. At the doorway, we paused as the custodian locked the wheels on the lectern to keep it from wandering. The supervisor stood near the exit, writing the outline of the training schedule on a small pad. He looked up once and met my gaze, then returned to his list. It was enough. Paper was moving where paper needed to move, and for once, it did not have to be carried only by my hands. Outside, night had cooled the parking lot into a flat pane of glass. Breath left our mouths in white threads. We crossed to the car without hurry. My grandson touched his cheek where the bruise had faded to a smudge, and then dropped his hand. The sky hung low and honest. Headlights swept and went. In the quiet, I found the place inside me where noise cannot reach. I set the folder on my lap before turning the key. I pressed my palm to it and felt the ridges of the tabs through the cardboard. Every tab stood for something that could have gone wrong and did not, because we named it. We found it in writing. We gave it a shape that other hands could lift. I thought of rivers and walls and the places where they meet without drowning each other. I thought of my wife's steady nods from doorways and the way she taught me that peace is an action, not a weather. We pulled out slowly. The building's windows showed our reflections for a moment and then let us go. However crooked the past, the future prospers with respect, unity, and contribution. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you do in my place? Until the next story.